Why is Mom here? Who did this to Mom?
The rotten wooden door of the abandoned house creaked open as Adewale Okoye hurried inside to escape the rain pouring down like a waterfall. The night wind from the countryside of Ogun States swept through the cracked walls, carrying the chill of damp earth. The billionaire who had just returned from London brushed the rain off his coat. His eyes, so used to the bright lights of the city, now struggled to adjust to the dim darkness of the deserted house. A bolt of lightning tore across the sky. For a split second, the white flash illuminated the room, just long enough for Adewale to see a woman curled up asleep in the corner, lying on the cold ground. At first, he assumed she was just a homeless person seeking shelter from the storm. But as he stepped closer, his heart suddenly slowed. The worn headscarf, the thin, fragile hands, and the familiar face he had not seen for many years. Adewale froze. No, this can't be. The woman sleeping in the corner was his mother. The same mother who once sold bags of corn in the village market so he could go to school. The same mother who sacrificed her entire life so her son could one day succeed. And now, she was sleeping in an abandoned house on a cold, rainy night. In that moment, the man who owned luxurious buildings in London suddenly felt smaller and more powerless than ever before. Because sometimes in life, we may earn a lot of money. But if we forget the person who sacrificed everything for us, then all that success becomes meaningless. If you believe that parents are the most precious gift in life, please subscribe to the channel to listen to more touching stories filled with powerful lessons about family. And stay until the end of this story. Because what Adewale discovered after waking his mother that rainy night left the entire village in shock. Inside the abandoned house, the air was thick with the smell of long-soaked mildew, rotting wood drenched by rain, and a cold dampness rising from the earth as if it were touching the skin itself. Each gust of wind slipping through the gaps in the rusted metal roof produced a low, mournful sound, like the weary sigh of the old house itself. Adewale stopped just inside the doorway. His expensive leather shoes stepped onto dust mixed with mud, looking strangely out of place in the middle of such ruin. He pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. A faint beam of light appeared, trembling with each breath, and with the hand that was still wet from the rain. The light slowly moved across cracked, stained walls past a window missing half its frame past two broken chairs lying on the floor like the skeletons of a life that had died long ago. In the corner stood a cracked clay jar. Beside it were a few old cans, a carefully tied plastic bag, and a torn mat spread over the cold ground. Adewale frowned slightly. This was not just a temporary place to hide from the rain. Someone had been living here. The thought sent a strange feeling through his chest, something sharp and thin like the edge of a blade. Not enough to hurt, but enough to slow his heartbeat. Outside, the rain continued to pound the roof relentlessly. His driver had not returned yet. The phone signal was so weak it was almost gone. Inside the decaying house in the rainy countryside of Ogun State, the man who had once led million-dollar negotiations in London suddenly felt strangely alone. He decided to wait by the door until the rain slowed. But then he heard a sound, very faint. Not the rain, not the wind. A breath, soft, weak, almost dissolving into the darkness. Up, Adewale quickly turned the beam of light toward the deepest corner of the room. In that curled shadow lay the shape of a person, sleeping on their side beneath a faded old blanket. The body was so small that without the fragile sound of breathing, he might have thought it was nothing more than a pile of discarded cloth. An old woman. Her feet stuck out from the edge of the blanket dry, thin and cracked from years of hardship. Beside her was a chipped ceramic bowl and a plastic bottle with only a little water left at the bottom. Adewale stood still for a few seconds. At first, he assumed she was simply a homeless woman taking shelter in this abandoned house like so many lives pushed to the margins by fate. He even considered quietly stepping away, leaving the stranger in peace. But something about the way she curled under the blanket held his gaze. Perhaps it was the way she pulled the blanket tightly to her chin, a habit formed over many cold nights. Perhaps it was the worn headscarf that had slipped halfway down, revealing strands of tangled gray hair still braided in the careful style of village women. Or perhaps it was because, in this cold and unfamiliar place, her small figure suddenly awakened a distant memory inside him, memories of childhood nights, when the power would go out, when his mother sat beside him, fanning him gently with a palm fan, while she leaned against the wall and fell asleep quietly. Adewale stepped closer. His footsteps were so slow it felt as if the whole house was listening. The light from his phone lowered gradually. Then it illuminated the woman's face. Time stopped. His heart tightened sharply, almost painfully. Her face had grown much thinner. Her cheekbones were high, her lips dry and cracked, her skin darkened by years of sun, wind, and hardship. Yet despite the deep marks of time, he recognized her immediately. He recognized the shape of that nose, that forehead, the faint scar near her left eyebrow, the scar she had gotten years ago when she fell at the market while trying to keep a sack of corn from spilling onto the road. Adwale froze. His entire body stiffened. The phone nearly slipped from his hand. Mother. The word escaped his lips so softly that he himself wasn't sure if he had actually spoken. The woman did not wake. She lay there, fragile and exhausted, like a lamp about to go out. Adwale dropped to his knees beside the torn mat, his knees touching the cold ground without him even noticing. All the blood in his body seemed to rush to his chest and choke in his throat. It couldn't be. This could not be real. His mother should be in the old house in the village, or staying with relatives. At the very least, she should be somewhere with a proper roof, a bed to sleep on, a kitchen where she could cook a decent meal. Not here, not in this collapsing abandoned house, not on a torn mat laid directly on the damp ground. Adwale stared at her without blinking, afraid that if he blinked even once, the scene before him would turn into another nightmare. But no, she was still there, painfully real. Her gray hair clung to her temples. Her thin shoulders trembled slightly with each weak breath. A mother who had poured out her entire life to lift her son out of poverty was now lying curled in the darkest corner of life, as if she no longer belonged anywhere. Memories rushed back violently. He saw himself years ago, a barefoot boy in a worn shirt, standing outside the school gate with an empty stomach. He remembered his mother arriving with that same old scarf on her head, pressing the last coin she had into his hand, and lying that she had already eaten at home. He remembered the evenings when she sat under the dim light of an oil lamp, mending his clothes while her eyes turned red from the smoke. He remembered those rough, calloused hands resting on his forehead whenever he had a fever. He remembered the day he left Nigeria to go abroad. She had stood in the yard, smiling, telling him not to look back. Just go, she said, go and become someone in life. And he had gone. Gone so far that he thought sending money home regularly was enough. Gone so far that their phone calls grew shorter. Gone so far that he believed success alone would repay all her sacrifices. But now, beneath the roar of rain on the broken roof, Adwale realized a cruel truth. Money could build mansions, buy luxury cars, and open doors in London, but it could never replace the presence of a son. During the years when his mother had been left behind, his trembling hand reached out and gently touched the edge of the old blanket. Mom. This time his voice was clearer, but it broke at the end. The woman on the mat stirred slightly. Her eyelashes trembled slowly. She did not open her eyes right away, as if her body was too tired to believe that someone was calling her with that familiar, tender word in the middle of this rainy night. Adwale held his breath, his entire body tense. Suddenly he felt afraid. Afraid she might open her eyes and not recognize him. Afraid she might recognize him and turn away. Afraid that in her gaze there would be something even more painful than poverty, disappointment. Outside, another lightning bolt tore across the sky before disappearing into darkness. The phone's light still shone softly on his mother's face. Adwale leaned closer, his eyes turning red without him even realizing it. For the first time in many years, the man was no longer a billionaire, no longer the pride of the village, no longer the confident figure walking out of boardrooms in a perfect suit. Inside that abandoned house, he was simply a son kneeling before the greatest pain of his life. And the rain outside had not stopped at all. Adwale trembled as he dropped to his knees on the cold ground. His knees pressed into the damp dust, though he barely felt it anymore. The phone in his hand still shone its pale yellow light, illuminating the aged face lying sideways on the torn mat. His heart pounded so violently that his chest ached. In his mind, every other sound seemed to fade away, leaving only the fierce drumming of rain on the rotten roof and the harsh rhythm of his own breathing. Mom, his voice escaped in a whisper, hoarse and fragile, as if speaking any louder might shatter the scene before him into a nightmare. The woman on the ground stirred slightly. Her eyelashes, faded by age, trembled. She opened her eyes slowly, like someone so accustomed to exhaustion and hardship that even waking required gathering the last of her strength. Her eyes were cloudier than before, etched with deep lines of time. But the moment she saw the face leaning close above her, A soft light flickered within them so gentle it hurt. She looked at him for a long moment. Not startled, not shocked, not accusing. Just a long gaze, heavy with love, as though she had imagined this moment hundreds of times during lonely nights. And now she was quietly confirming that it was real. Then her lips moved slightly. A fragile smile appeared on her thin face. Adwale, you read back. Inside Adwale, the world collapsed in that instant. Not when he first saw her lying in the corner of the abandoned house. Not when he recognized the old scarf on her head. But when he heard her say his name in that same gentle voice. The same tender voice that spoke as if nothing painful had ever happened. His throat tightened. He bent forward, one hand bracing against the ground, while the other trembled as it touched his mother's shoulder, afraid she might disappear if he held her too firmly. Her clothes were cold, thin and damp. One shoulder was still wet with rain that had not yet dried. Beneath the old blanket, her body felt so light it twisted his heart. This was no longer the strong woman who once carried sacks of cassava at the market, who walked miles to sell vegetables so she could pay his school fees. This was an old woman worn down by life until almost nothing remained but bone and quiet endurance. Mom, he said it again, but his voice broke apart. His mother, the woman who raised him with simple meals and simple lessons. The woman who wore the same old clothes through many rainy seasons, so she could save money to buy him books. The woman who sent him away with worn sandals and a radiant smile, as if she was willing to remain in the darkness as long as her son could step into the light. The woman he had believed for years that he was taking care of simply by sending money home regularly. And yet now, she was lying on the cold ground of an abandoned house, with nothing beside her but a small faded cloth bag. Adwell glanced around again, as if hoping he had misunderstood something. But he hadn't. There was no bed, no kitchen fire, no trace of a dignified life. Only 4 moldy walls, a leaking roof, a few pitiful belongings, and his mother trying to curl herself smaller to keep warm in the night. He looked down at the cloth bag beside her. It was painfully small, the kind of bag someone might use to carry a few worn clothes, a scarf, perhaps a small bottle of medicine or a handful of coins. At this moment, his mother's entire life seemed to fit inside that single bag. A woman who had sacrificed everything to build a future for her son, now possessed nothing but a temporary shelter and a bag so light it felt as if the world had drained her of everything. Adwale could hardly breathe. Mom, why are you here? The question burst from him in near desperation. It wasn't just a question. It was panic, shame, rising anger with nowhere to land. It was the feeling of a man suddenly realizing that everything he had believed for years might have been nothing more than a fragile illusion. His mother shook her head slightly. The movement was slow and weak, yet her expression remained strangely calm. Don't worry about me, she said softly, her voice like a faint breeze slipping through the broken roof. I'm fine. That calmness hurt Adwale more than any words could. If she had cried, he might have endured it. If she had blamed him, he might have felt a little less guilty. If she had told a bitter story, he would at least know where to direct his anger. But she didn't. She simply said she was fine. The familiar sentence spoken by mothers who spend their lives swallowing pain so their children don't have to carry it. A simple sentence, yet cruel, because it revealed how long she had endured suffering without even believing it was something worth mentioning anymore. Adwell lowered his head, his eyes burning. He remembered their phone calls. His mother's voice always calm, always saying everything was fine. He remembered the days when he was rushing into meetings, asking only a few quick questions before hanging up. He remembered a moment when she coughed softly on the phone, but when he asked about it she laughed and said it was just the weather. He had believed her. Or perhaps, deep down he had wanted to believe. Because believing his mother was fine allowed him to continue living his successful life far away without feeling too much guilt. Now each memory felt like a blade. He clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. Mom, who let you live like this? He asked quietly. Where is the money I sent home? What happened to the old house? Why are you here alone in the rain? His mother looked at him for a moment, then slowly turned her face away. Not because she had hurt him, but because there was a deep weariness in her eyes, as if she had been too tired for too long to explain everything she had endured. She pulled the old blanket up to her chest, a small, instinctive gesture, as though she still wanted to hide her misery from her son. You just came back from a long journey, she whispered. Dunty asked too many questions right now. I'm really fine. Fine. That word again. Outside, the wind howled through the palm trees. A drop of water from the leaking roof fell beside Adwell's hand. He looked up at the rusted metal sheets full of holes, then back at his mother. The rain did more than soak her clothes. It leaked through the roof, chilled the ground, stretched the night longer, and deepened the humiliation of this moment. Something inside Adwell changed. Before stepping into this abandoned house, he had been a successful man returning home with plans to surprise his family. Expensive gifts waited in the car. His mind was full of future plans. He believed this visit would be nothing more than a warm reunion. But now everything had shattered. In its place stood a brutal truth. His mother had been living in hardship beneath the shadow of the very name that the village praised. While people spoke of him with pride, the woman who built his life had been left alone in the darkest corner of the world. Her calmness did not soften the pain. It made it deeper, because Adwell understood something clearly. Only someone who had endured for far too long could smile gently in such a place and say she was fine. He leaned down and gently took his mother's hand. It was cold, dry, and trembling, but when his fingers tightened around it, she squeezed back faintly just enough to ignite an old memory. When he was little, whenever they walked through muddy roads on the way to the market, she would hold his hand exactly like this, so he would fall. Only now, the one on the verge of falling was no longer the little boy. It was the heart of the man kneeling before her. Adwell looked up at his mother, his eyes red, his face hardened by pain, and a quiet determination slowly forming within him. He still didn't know the whole truth. He didn't know what had happened in the months or years he had been away. He didn't know who had allowed his mother to fall into this misery. But he knew one thing for certain. This rainy night would not end like an ordinary storm. Because from the moment his mother opened her eyes and softly spoke his name inside that abandoned house, everything in Adwell's life had changed forever. The next morning, the night storm had passed, but the sky above Ogun State was still covered in a pale gray haze, heavy as if the heavens themselves were not yet ready to let go of the sorrow of the night before. The last drops of water still clinging to the rusted metal roof of the abandoned house fell slowly onto the ground, making soft tapping sounds in the quiet of the early morning. The smell of wet earth, fresh grass after rain, and old rotting wood still lingered in the air. Adwell stood at the doorway of the house, one hand supporting his mother, the other holding the black umbrella he had taken from the car after his driver returned near dawn. His elderly mother walked very slowly. After a night with almost no sleep, she still tried to keep the same calm expression, but every step revealed a weakness she could no longer hide. Her worn sandals were stained with mud. The hem of her wrapper was dark from dampness. Her headscarf was still wrapped neatly, as if it were the last piece of dignity she was trying to preserve. Adwell said very little. From the moment dawn began to break, he had been almost completely silent. But it was not the silence of peace. It was a dense block of anger pressed down to a dangerous limit. His face was colder than the morning after the rain. His jaw was clenched. His eyes had darkened. The man who had once appeared on the covers of business magazines with perfect composure and control now looked like a flame trapped inside steel. When he led his mother out of the abandoned house, a few village children saw them first. They stood along the dirt road, barefoot and dressed in simple clothes, staring at the glossy black suv, and then at the old woman being helped beneath the umbrella. One child ran off, then another. In moments, the news spread as quickly as wind through the palm trees. Adwell had returned. Not only had he returned, but he had been seen stepping out of the abandoned house on the edge of the village with his mother. And in a small village where secrets rarely die completely, but instead lie still, waiting for the day they break open, that sight was enough to pull people out of their yards, away from their cooking fires, away from unfinished conversations. Before long, people had begun gathering along the road leading back into the village. A few at first, then more. Neighbors clustered into small groups. Some faces showed shock. Some eyes carried confusion. One woman covered her mouth with her hand. Others simply stared in silence. No one stepped forward right away. The crowd had the look of people who had held on to something for too long and no longer knew where to begin now that the truth was standing in front of them. Adwell felt their eyes on him. He stopped walking. His mother stopped too, her thin hand tightening lightly around his arm as if she sensed what was coming. She did not look at anyone. She simply lowered her head. That small gesture made Adwell's chest tighten as though someone had gripped it hard. An innocent mother stood in the very village where she had lived, carrying herself like someone who should be ashamed, when in truth, It should have been those responsible who lowered their faces. An old man from the village slowly stepped forward. He was elderly, bent with age, walking with the same wooden cane Adwale remembered well. Adwale recognized him immediately. Baba Tund, the man who had carried him in his arms when he was a child, the same man who still sat beneath the Iroko tree in the evenings telling stories to the village children. Today, the usual gentleness was gone from his eyes. In its place was a deep, unbearable guilt. He stood before Adwale, looked at him for a long moment, then let out a heavy breath. "My son," he said, his voice rough with both age and difficulty. "We thought you already knew." Adwale frowned. A cold feeling ran down his spine. Knew what? His question was not loud, but it was as sharp as a blade. Baba Tund did not answer right away. He looked down at the ground, the tip of his cane touching the muddy earth. Behind him, the entire crowd fell silent, even the distant crowing of roosters, the rustling of palm leaves, the sound of an engine somewhere along the village road. It all seemed to pull away from this moment. Then the old man spoke, one word at a time, as though each one was heavy enough to require strength to lift. 3 months ago your mother was thrown out of the house. The blood in Adwale's body seemed to freeze. For a moment, he thought he had heard wrong, or perhaps not heard wrong, but his mind refused to accept what the words actually meant. Thrown out. He repeated slowly and quietly, like a man trying to confirm the existence of something impossible. No one answered at once, because the silence itself was the answer. Baba Tund closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, full of pain. A middle-aged woman standing among the villagers stepped forward halfway. Adwale recognized her as Mama Said, the woman who lived closest to his mansion. She was usually talkative, but now her voice was smaller, as if even she feared the weight of what she was about to say. "Your wife," she said, unable to meet his eyes. "She said your mother made the family look bad, so she was not allowed to stay in the mansion anymore." All sound disappeared, not literally, but inside Adwale's mind, the whole world dropped into a terrifying emptiness. He could still see the woman's lips moving. He could still see the pain on the faces behind her. He could still see his mother standing beside him, her back drawn slightly inward as if those words were a whip striking across a past she had tried to bury. But it all felt covered by a sheet of glass. Distant, distorted, real. 3 months. 3 months. The number hammered through his mind like iron being struck. 3 months ago his mother had been thrown out of the house. 3 months ago she had begun sleeping in that abandoned place. 3 months ago, while he was still in London, signing major contracts, attending elegant parties, answering calls from international partners, his mother had been forced out of the very home that should have sheltered her. 3 months. 90 days. How many rainy nights? How many cold mornings? How many times had she held that little cloth bag and sat alone in the dark, waiting for daylight? How many times had she gone hungry without saying a word? How many times had she looked toward the mansion where her son sent money so she could live in peace yet could not step inside? Adwale felt his stomach twist violently. The anger inside him was no longer a flame. It had turned into something darker, heavier, more dangerous, a cold fury that made his fingertips go numb. "That's impossible," he said, though this time the words were not meant to deny the villagers, but to keep himself from exploding. "I sent money home regularly. I called. I made it very clear that my mother was to be properly cared for." No one interrupted him. Some villagers lowered their heads. Others exchanged glances, as if each of them had once assumed that the man standing before them must have known, must have agreed, must somehow have been behind it all. Because otherwise, how could such cruelty continue for 3 months, in the middle of the village, without anything changing? That thought hurt Adwale all over again. It was not only that his mother had been abandoned. His own name had also been used as a cover for that cruelty. Baba Tund spoke again, his voice even sadder than before. "We thought you knew, because no one could imagine that a son like you would have no idea how his mother was living." Those words struck directly at Adwale's pride. He looked at his mother. She was still silent. Her aged face showed almost nothing, only her eyes lowered to the ground. But that silence was what made it most terrifying. It meant this had not happened yesterday. It was not a passing outburst of anger from someone. It had gone on long enough for pain to become routine, for humiliation to become normal, for a mother to learn how to make herself so small that she nearly disappeared from the world. "Mom," Adwale turned to her, his voice rough. "Is it true?" She did not answer right away. Her hand moved gently to adjust the edge of her headscarf. Such a tiny gesture, as if she were still trying to hold on to the last trace of neatness. after dignity had already been trampled too many times. Then she gave a small nod, just one very slight nod, but it was stronger than any accusation. Adewale closed his eyes. In his mind rose the image of the grand mansion with its polished walls, imported sofas, and the family parties he had paid for generously to preserve their status. He remembered the regular bank transfers he had sent home. He remembered his wife telling him that his mother was fine, that she simply preferred peace and quiet. He remembered the short phone calls he had trusted far too easily. Now everything connected. Everything had become evidence of a horrifying betrayal. Not a betrayal of money, a betrayal of trust, a betrayal of roots, a betrayal of the woman who had given him his life. A strong gust of wind swept across the village road, making his mother's wrapper flutter slightly and sending wet leaves skidding through the mud. Adewale opened his eyes. The shock was no longer in them. It had turned into something so cold and sharp that several people standing nearby stepped back without meaning to. He looked at the crowd, at Baba Tund, at Mama Said, then toward the mansion deeper in the village, the tiled roof and wide walls still visible behind the trees. Standing there like a cruel mockery of the abandoned house on the outskirts, where his mother had just emerged. 3 months. For 3 months, his mother had slept on cold ground. For 3 months, he had sent money home faithfully. For 3 months, he had believed the woman who sacrificed her entire life for him was living in peace. That truth did not merely wound him, it changed him. Adewale drew in a slow breath. The hand supporting his mother tightened more firmly, like a silent promise that from this moment on, she would never again have to stand alone before any crowd. Then he spoke, his voice low and calm in a way that was terrifying. Put my mother in the car. No one moved for a second, because everyone understood that the real storm in this story had not been the rain from the night before. It had begun the moment a son learned the truth about the cruelest 3 months of his mother's life. That afternoon, the sky above Adewale's mansion had cleared somewhat, but the air itself carried a strange heaviness, as if the real storm was no longer outside, but had quietly gathered within those elegant walls. The late sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows, stretching across the polished stone floor, over the expensive cream-colored sofas, and across the neatly framed family photographs lining the hallway. Everything was still perfect, still luxurious, still built to display success. But today, that very splendor felt cold. By Adewale's order, a family meeting was arranged that same afternoon. Messages were sent out quickly. His aunts, uncles, cousins, several respected elders in the family, and even those close family friends who regularly visited the mansion were all invited. No one was told why. They only knew that Adewale had returned suddenly from London and wanted everyone present. That alone was enough for rumors to spread from the mansion gates across half the village. Some thought he was about to announce major news about his business. Others assumed he wanted to host a celebration. A few sensed that something was wrong, but no one could have imagined the shock waiting behind the living room doors. One car after another pulled into the courtyard. One person after another stepped inside the house in neat clothes, bringing polite smiles and curious greetings. The house staff served drinks. The curtains were drawn back, and the chandelier was turned on even though evening had not fully arrived. The large living room gradually filled with the sounds of chairs moving, glasses clinking, and ordinary conversation. Yet amid all that activity, there was one thing that did not fit: Adewale's absence, and Kioma's unsettling calm. She stood in the middle of the luxurious living room like its rightful mistress. Her dress was beautifully tailored, elegant in color, but expensive enough for anyone to recognize the taste of a woman accustomed to wealth. Her hair was perfectly arranged, her lipstick flawless. Her smile was the same as always, confident, composed, slightly proud. She moved among the relatives with the ease of someone who believed she was still in control. Kioma had no idea what had happened the night before. She did not know how her husband had stood frozen inside the abandoned house at the edge of the village. She did not know how he had dropped to his knees before his mother. She did not know what eyes the village had looked at him with that morning when the truth came out. She still believed everything remained safely buried beneath the facade she had carefully built for months, that the old woman she had forced out of this mansion would remain silent, that her successful husband in London would hear only what she wanted him to hear, that reputation, appearances, and confidence could continue to cover cruelty. So when one of the aunts smiled and softly asked, "Where is Adewale?" Chioma simply replied that he was changing and would be down soon. Her voice was so steady that no one noticed how her hand absent-mindedly adjusted the bracelet on her wrist, a small gesture that only appeared when she wanted to reassure herself that she was still in the winning position. Then the living room door opened. The hinges made only the faintest sound. But in that instant, the entire room seemed to freeze. Adwell stepped in first. He no longer looked like a man returning home for a family reunion. There was no smile, no gentle gesture, no trace of weariness from a long journey. He wore dark clothing, stood straight, and his face was so cold it made even the lights in the room seem sharper. Every step he took across the stone floor echoed clearly in the sudden silence, and beside him was his mother. She walked very slowly, her old headscarf wrapped more neatly than it had been that morning, but nothing could hide the thinness and exhaustion left behind by 3 months of rejection. The clothes she was wearing had been changed into something newer, surely prepared by Adwell earlier that day, but her frail body and tired steps still told anyone who looked at her this woman had not been treated with dignity. Her hand rested lightly on her son's arm, not quite leaning on him, but as if she still could not fully believe she was allowed to step back into this place. The entire room fell silent. An aunt standing near the sofa nearly dropped her teacup. A cousin opened his mouth, then shut it again. 2 housemaids standing near the side door exchanged startled looks. The curious expressions for moments before turned to shock, and then slowly into something heavier, a terrible sense that something was deeply wrong. In that atmosphere, Kioma was the one who froze most visibly. The smile on her lips did not disappear immediately. It simply faltered, like a mask that had suddenly cracked. Her eyes widened when she saw the old woman. For one brief second, all the color seemed to drain from her face. But Chioma was someone used to keeping her composure in front of a crowd. She recovered almost at once, though the confidence she had carried just moments before was gone. When she spoke, there was something slightly off in her voice, like a string pulled too tight. "Do you rehear?" It was a foolish question. The moment it left her mouth, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. Because it was not the question of a daughter-in-law surprised to see her mother-in-law returning home. It was the reflex of someone who had believed the woman she cast out would never again appear before a room full of witnesses. Adwell stopped in the middle of the living room. He turned to look at his wife. He did not raise his voice. He did not point. He did not shout. But that very calm made everything more frightening. This was no longer the silence of a man holding back anger. It was the cold stillness of a man who had seen the truth too clearly to be blinded by excuses ever again. "Do you know," he said, his voice calm and freezing, "where my mother has been sleeping for the past 3 months?" No one in the room dared breathe too loudly. The question fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending invisible ripples across every face. Some relatives turned to look at Chioma. Others looked at the elderly woman standing beside Adwell. A few seemed to be connecting old rumors from the village with the scene now unfolding before them. Chioma parted her lips as if to say something, but no words came. She did not answer, perhaps because she did not know how. Perhaps because she understood that one wrong word would make everything collapse at once. Adwell did not wait. He slowly turned to face everyone in the room, his gaze passing over one familiar face after another, people who had eaten, laughed, and celebrated in this very room while outside. His elderly mother had been shrinking into a dark corner of the village. "In an abandoned house," he said, pronouncing every word clearly, "outside the village." A wave of whispers spread through the room. Not loud, not chaotic, but low and trembling, like wind forcing its way through closed shutters. The aunts looked at one another. One uncle frowned in stunned disbelief. An older woman pressed a hand to her chest. Someone muttered a soft, "My God." The false peace of the family gathering dissolved in an instant, revealing the face of a tragedy that no one could ignore any longer. Kioma began to tremble, not openly, very slightly, beginning in her hands. Her fingers tightened around each other until they turned pale. Her shoulders stiffened. Her eyes moved quickly around the room, as if measuring how many exits remained. But it was the silence of everyone else that frightened her most. No one rushed to defend her. No one laughed it off. No one said it must be a misunderstanding. The looks in the room had begun to change. And for someone like Chioma, who lived through image and appearances, that was the most terrifying sign of all. Adwell remained standing there, one hand supporting his mother, as if from that place he was speaking not only to his wife, but to the whole house, to every wall that had witnessed the lies, to every expensive object used to cover a shame that could never be forgiven. 3 months, he continued, his voice still even, but every word cutting like steel against glass. For 3 months, my mother was pushed out of this house. For 3 months, she slept on cold ground. For 3 months, I sent money home regularly and believed she was being properly cared for. The air in the room grew so heavy it was hard to breathe. Kioma swallowed hard. She tried to gather the last shred of dignity she had left. Adwell, I can explain. Explain, he repeated, and for the first time there was a sharp edge in his voice like a blade. Explain what? Explain why the woman who gave birth to me, who raised me with her whole life, was treated like something that made the family look bad. Or explain why this mansion is large enough for guests, for parties, for every kind of luxury and display, but had no room for my mother. Every sentence drained more color from Kioma's face. The lavish living room, with its glittering chandelier, expensive drapes, and the scent of costly perfume, had suddenly become a place where cruelty was exposed beyond denial. That contrast made the scene even more painful. On one side stood polished wealth, on the other, an elderly mother who had just been brought back from an abandoned house outside the village. No explanation could bridge that distance. Adwell's mother remained silent. She did not interrupt, she did not accuse. She did not cry before the crowd or recount her suffering. She simply stood beside her son, her eyes lowered, like someone who had endured too much pain to even demand justice for herself anymore. And that silence made Adwell's words land even harder. At last, one of the older aunts spoke, her voice full of disbelief. Kioma, is this true? Kioma turned toward her, her lips trembling, but there no longer seemed to be any answer strong enough to hold back the wall of truth collapsing around her. Adwell looked at his wife once more. There was no longer the gaze of a husband looking at his partner. It was the gaze of a man who had finally seen betrayal in the very place where he had once placed his deepest trust. Outside, the late afternoon sun still streamed through the glass. But inside that room, no one felt any light anymore. Because the family gathering everyone had assumed was an ordinary reunion had become a courtroom without a judge's bench. And Kioma, standing in that luxurious living room, had begun to understand that her real nightmare was not her mother-in-law's return. It was the fact that the truth had walked in with her. The air in the living room felt so heavy that it seemed one raised voice would be enough to shatter everything. The chandelier still cast its warm golden light, the kind meant to make a home feel elegant and welcoming, but now, under the weight of the truth that had just been exposed, that same light made every face in the room look clearer, harsher, more stripped bare. No one could maintain their polite expression anymore. The whispers had died completely. The glasses of water on the table sat almost untouched. Every eye was fixed on Kioma, the woman who had stood in this very room moments ago with a confident smile, and who now seemed pushed into an invisible corner by the silence of everyone around her. Kioma was still standing there, but all her composure was gone. Her shoulders had stiffened. The carefully applied makeup on her face could no longer hide the paleness spreading beneath the powder. Her lips were pressed tightly together, as if she were trying to keep them from trembling in front of the family. She looked at Adwell, then at his mother, then around the room as if searching for a sympathetic glance, a word of rescue, some small excuse that could help her escape the feeling of being stripped bare before everyone. But no one said a word, because in that moment, every excuse looked small and shameful beside the sight of an elderly mother who had just been brought back from an abandoned house outside the village. Adwell still stood tall in the middle of the living room. One hand supported his mother. The other hung at his side, his fingers curling and uncurling slightly as if he were trying to control the anger still burning inside him. His face was so cold it seemed to lower the temperature of the room. If he spoke again now, his words would no longer be mere exposure, they would become the final cut that ended everything. But before Adwell could say another word, an old hand gently touched his. The gesture was so light that anyone standing farther away might not even have noticed it. And yet it was enough to stop him. Adwell looked down. It was his mother. She did not grip him hard. She did not pull him back. She simply laid her thin, dry, wrinkled hand over the back of her son, his hand with the familiar tenderness of a mother who had spent her whole life soothing her child's pain. Even when she herself was the one hurting most, she gave a slight shake of her head, a very small shake, almost fragile, yet within it was pleading endurance and unconditional love. "My son," she said. Her voice was not loud, but in that completely silent room, every word rang out clearly. Dante let the family fall apart because of me. Those words seemed to tighten the whole room like a fist. An elderly aunt raised a hand to her mouth. Another woman turned away quickly to blink back tears. Even Baba Tund, who had been invited as one of the respected elders of the village to witness the truth, quietly sighed and lowered his eyes. Because nothing hurts people more than seeing someone who has been wounded to the deepest level still be the first person thinking of peace for others. Adewale's mother had been driven out of the mansion. She had slept on the cold floor of an abandoned house for 3 months. She had silently endured hunger, rain, humiliation, and the pitying looks of the villagers. And yet, the moment she stood before a rare chance to be defended, to have justice spoken for her, the first thing she thought about was not herself. It was the family, her son's happiness, the destruction that might follow if his anger went too far. Some mothers are like that. They carry wounds in their hearts, yet use that same heart to cover the faults of others, only so their children will not have to walk through ruins and suffer one more time. Adwale looked at his mother, and for a moment, the hardness in his face cracked. His eyes reddened, not because he was weak, but because some pain cannot hold its shape when it touches a mother's love. He remembered the night before, when she had lain curled up on a torn mat in that abandoned house, and still smiled as she called his name. He remembered that morning, when she had lowered her head before the villagers as if she feared her son might be ashamed of her. And now, in front of a room full of family, that same woman was asking him not to let the family break apart because of her. That was what made Adewale's pain deeper than all his anger, because he understood clearly. His mother was not weak. She just loved him too much, loved him enough to swallow every humiliation, as long as her son would not have to live with a fracture in his family. Adewale slowly turned fully toward his mother. He took her hand tightly in his. Her hand was tiny inside his broad, strong palm. It felt light as a dry branch, yet those same hands had once carried him through muddy roads, washed the few old clothes he wore to school, and sold vegetables in the blazing sun so he could have money for books. His whole life had begun in those hands. Everything he was today had been built on those silent calluses. When he lifted his head again, his voice had changed. It was no longer only the coldness of a man who had been betrayed. It was the certainty of a man who now understood exactly what was worth preserving and what could no longer be tolerated. "No one," he said slowly, his eyes fixed on the space in the middle of the room as if he wanted to carve each word into the very walls, "in this house will ever have to sleep in darkness again." No one spoke after that sentence, but everyone felt its weight. It was not comfort, not a soft promise made to calm temporary emotions. It was a declaration. A line had just been drawn. A vow from a son who had once gone too far from his roots and who had now returned and seen the true cost of blind trust. Kioma shifted slightly. She lifted her head to look at Adewale, confusion and fear mixed in her eyes. Perhaps only now did she truly understand that what she was losing was not merely her position as a respected wife in the family. What was slipping from her hands was something far greater: trust. And once trust had shattered in this house, no late explanation could put it back together. When Adewale's mother heard her son speak, she lowered her head softly. A tear slowly rolled down her wrinkled cheek. She did not cry aloud. There was only that tear, moving silently through the months of endurance she had told no one about, through the 3 months of sleeping in the cold, through the times she had been hungry and still said she was full, through the rainy nights when all she could do was pull the thin blanket tighter around herself and pray for morning to come faster. That tear was not only pain. It was also relief, relief that at last her son had seen. At last she no longer had to hide. At last, someone had stepped into that darkness and awakened her with the word mother, choked with feeling, just as in the old days. An older aunt quietly wiped her eyes and said very softly, almost to herself, "Every mother only wants her child to be at peace." No one answered, because everyone knew it was true. And that was exactly what made this story so painful. If that mother had been bitter, perhaps people would have felt less broken. If she had been angry, perhaps this room could still divide itself into right and wrong. But she had done neither. She had simply continued to love even after being treated with cruelty. And that love, in this moment, forced everyone standing there to look back at themselves. Outside the windows, the sky was slowly clearing after the long storm. The gray clouds began to drift away, making room for a pale blue light in the late afternoon. From the palm trees in the yard, drops of rain still fell, glittering under the new sunlight. The storm had truly stopped. But inside the hearts of those present, another movement had just begun. It was the shame of those who had seen and not intervened soon enough. It was the bitterness of a son realizing he had sent money faithfully, yet still missed the true loneliness of his mother. It was the fear of a woman who had believed outward elegance could hide cruelty. And above all, it was the lesson now carved deeply into everyone's mind with ink that could never fade. A mother's pain is always quieter than people imagine, but her love is greater than any house, any status, any amount of money. Adewale slowly helped his mother sit down in the largest chair in the living room. Not in a corner, not in some place hidden behind others, but in the brightest spot, at the very center of the luxurious room that once had no place for her. He bent down and adjusted the shawl on her shoulders, slowly and carefully, as if trying to make up for every day he had been absent. She looked up at her son. In her tired eyes, the exhaustion was still there, but now there was something else too, the fragile piece of someone who was finally being recognized as a rightful part of this home. No one in the room felt the same anymore, because they understood that after this afternoon, this mansion would no longer be only a symbol of success. It would become a place that remembered a truth no one was allowed to forget, that sometimes a man's greatest wealth is not found in what he owns, not in luxury cars, great houses, bank accounts, or the applause of society, but in the mother who suffered quietly so he could stand where he stands today. A mother who could sleep in darkness and still pray that her child would live in the light. A mother who was hurt, yet still feared that her son and his family might fall apart. A mother who had sacrificed her whole life and never once demanded to be repaid as she deserved. And in that room, with the rain finally stopped beyond the windows, everyone at last understood that some lessons are never taught with words. They are taught with tears, with silence, with an old hand resting on her son's hand in her deepest pain only to say, "Don't fall apart because of me."